anytime someone has power, they are unlikely to give it up. I mean, that's what the entire Marvel and DC universes are about. And so you've got Thanos on the Republican Party collecting the Infinity Stones of voter suppression and using it to basically wipe out half of the electorate, saying you don't get to vote. Well, we've got to be the Avengers who assemble ourselves, not because we all have the same powers or the same beliefs or even from the same place, but we know that if we don't work together to take that gauntlet back, then we are going to be erased from the history and from the future of our country. That's why this matters.
Damn, that was an amazing analogy. I am so impressed.
Thank you.
As the United States rises in protest against the violent deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many other Black lives, there may be no more important time to vote than this upcoming November election. Young people are very often accused of being apathetic citizens who do not vote, but what's often not addressed is that students and many people of color are susceptible to targeted voter suppression. And basically, voter suppression is any effort to prevent someone from being able to cast their ballot. We just saw it happen recently when President Trump threatened to hold up federal funds in places like Michigan and Nevada for making it easier to vote during this coronavirus pandemic. Voter suppression can also be a form of systemic racism. And while people are protesting and making their voices heard in the streets, it's important that we use our voices at the polls as well. So what can you do to make sure that your vote isn't obstructed? That's what this episode aims to answer.
Well, I am Rapsody. I'm an MC. I'm a healer. I'm a storyteller. Agree. But I'm also a daughter. A sister, a auntie, a friend. That's me. I do vote in North Carolina. That is definitely where I reside. I started voting the year Barack Obama won the presidency. For a while, we've had our battles, with, who's in office and rezoning and, voter suppression. And I've seen those votes. I remember specifically about having to have a certain form of ID to even vote because, before it was just, you would just go, you have to show any ID.
When Rap talks about rezoning, she's talking about gerrymandering. It's when a political party manipulates regions to give themselves an unfair advantage by redrawing the district boundary lines to pick the voters they want. That way, instead of certain people giving opposition in a district, they're reallocated to a different one.
Rapsody is from North Carolina, one of the worst offenders for gerrymandering.
Can you kind of just speak to why you think voter suppression is a thing in the first place?
Because they realize the power that we have and with our voice, especially when you want a certain type of person in office and in power. You're gonna use these group of people who we don't stand for none of this. That has been going on for centuries and centuries in America. That have not only suppress votes, but suppress so many other things, that affect us day to day. And we had to fight to even get the right to vote, to be counted. Men, women, as we continue to evolve and go through time as a people, we realize and we become more educated and more powerful. And that's scary for some people.
It comes down to power, really, at the end of the day. The way our country is set up in a democracy, votes swing who has power, who has leverage, who can get things done, who can't. My name is Malcolm Jenkins. I'm a safety now for the New Orleans Saints. It's going into my 12th year as an NFL player. I'm also the co-founder of a 501c3 and 501c4 advocacy group of all NFL players that fight for criminal justice reform, we fight for educational reform, things that have to do with social justice around the country. When we look at the racial makeup and history of our country, it's in the best interest, or used to be in the best interest of white America to protect the interests of white America and not share, those rights with anybody else. Whether you shut down voting sites and make people travel far distances to get to their vote or to cast their votes, or the lines are really, really long, and you're making people, spend time that they could otherwise be doing, making money, be at their jobs, or doing other things to vote, just makes it really, really tough. And where this happens most often are in communities of color, communities that are already disadvantaged.
One of the clearest manifestations of voter suppression occurred during Georgia's 2018 race for governor.
My name is Stacey Abrams, and I am the founder of Fair Fight, Fair Count, and the Southern Economic Advancement Project. I ran for governor in 2018. My opponent in the general election was the Secretary of State. In the state of Georgia, the Secretary of State is in charge of the election. He's responsible for overseeing how the votes are cast and counted. And therefore, I basically was running against the contestant, the referee, and the scorekeeper in the same person. He was Secretary of State for 8 years. And during that time, he kicked 1.4 million people off of the voter rolls, which meant they couldn't vote unless they re-registered. He held 53,000 applications to register hostage. He refused to process them. That meant that 53,000 people, 70% of whom were Black, 80% of whom were people of color, could not register to vote. He oversaw the closure of 214 precincts, meaning the polling places where people would go to cast their ballots got shut down. That meant that between 54 and 85,000 people had nowhere to go to cast their ballots. And under his leadership, we had the longest lines for African Americans in the country, up to 4 hours or more. And that's not a good thing. That wasn't just excitement. It was because they had some precincts that they had the machines, but no power cords. Some places the machines were broken, or they would have a couple of machines for thousands of people to use. And so that was the voter suppression. People were not able to cast a ballot and be heard. And because of that, their voices were ignored in our election. It was a very close election. It was 1.4% difference. And had I won, I would have been the first Black woman to be a governor of a state in the history of the United States.
As a result of her 2018 campaign, Abrams created Fair Fight to promote fair elections in Georgia and around the country, to encourage voter participation in elections, and educate voters about elections and their voting rights.
Voter suppression is any administrative or any action taken by someone in power to block you from being able to cast a vote. It happens in 3 ways. One is, can you get registered, and can you stay on the rolls? Meaning, can you get the keys to the car, or do they take them back? Because that's what registration is. If you don't get registered, the rest of the process doesn't work. The second is, do you have the ability to cast a ballot? And that's where things like voter ID come in place. If you don't have the right ID, they have the authority to deny you a ballot. And what we've seen happen in the last 20 years is they've made getting an ID harder and harder. In the state of Texas, you can vote if you have a gun license, but not if you have a student ID. And so that's one example of, do they make it hard? It's also, do they close down where you vote? If you're on a college campus, especially Black colleges, some of those colleges used to have voting precincts on their campus. In Texas and in Florida, they tried to shut them down because too many people voted. And then the third is, does your ballot count? So you get through the first 2 hoops, but what they will do is, if you have the wrong, if they don't like who you are, if they think you don't have the right information, they'll give you something called a provisional ballot. That means you get to vote, but they can throw that vote away if you don't come back and prove to them that you had the right to vote. Or people who vote by absentee, if the signature doesn't look like the signature they used when they signed up to vote, they can throw your ballot out. And so it's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? That's voter suppression. It's not just about people of color. If you look at what they did in New Hampshire decided too many college students were voting there. And so they've made it almost impossible for students who spend 9 months out of the year living in that state, spending their tax dollars. They have to jump through hoops in order to be able to vote. The same thing is true in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and across the country. Voter suppression targets the people that right now that Republicans don't want to hear from. Because let's be clear, Both parties have engaged in voter suppression, but in the 21st century, it has been entirely the province of Republicans because they know that young people, people of color, and poor people are the most likely to vote for Democrats. And so if you stop these communities from voting, they get to keep power without actually having to fix their policies and do the things that would actually help them in elections.
It turns out, and this is something even I didn't know, your voter registration can be deleted if you don't use it. In other words, if you haven't voted since Obama ran for president, your registration might have been purged.
The right to vote is the only right we can lose for not using it. The United States is the only major country that considers itself an industrialized democracy that makes you do the work. More than that, we make you jump through hoops to even get on the rolls. In Georgia, in December, they purged, meaning they removed 309,000 people, many of whom did not vote. They voted for Barack Obama in 2008, but they haven't voted since.
Voter suppression is not a new thing. It is literally, we've seen it change forms from emancipation all the way until 2020.
This isn't like some pre-Selma type thing either. This is now. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War. It was considered one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court deemed Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. The decision was immediately taken advantage of.
Until 65, the right to vote was not only nearly impossible, it was dangerous. 65, we get the Voting Rights Act. That really put the catalyst behind the right to vote because it meant that people could register, that they could participate, and they could run for office. And then we got the 26th Amendment, which allowed young people to vote at the age of 18. Each of those laws has created space for voting, but voter suppression has always been about trying to take back what has been gained through blood and fighting and legislation. And that's why we saw in 2013, the Supreme Court say that the Voting Rights Act essentially had outlived its usefulness. The minute they did that, almost 2 hours later, the state of Texas passed one of the most restrictive voter ID laws, the thing I mentioned earlier. They passed the law that said you could have your gun license, but not your student ID to go and vote. When we lost the Voting Rights Act in 2013, we were set back decades. And the work that I'm trying to do is about making sure that we can get back to where we were in 65, and more importantly, that we can get to where we need to be in 2021.
Will we have a free and fair election at this year's race for president? With the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting the fragility of in-person voting, many wonder if the elections will be delayed or if vote counting will be slowed down. Preparing for November is at the top of Abrams' agenda. She's pushing Congress to make states scale up their vote-by-mail initiatives and to be able to conduct safe, in-person, early, and same-day voting.
And now we're in a COVID crisis where you got cities on lockdown and you can't go to the library like you used to. So we're having to make sure that people can participate from wherever they are, whether it's mail, whether it's online, it's in person. All of these options have to be opened up to make sure that everybody's vote, matters.
Why does Rapsody speak about social issues, not only on her platform, but also in her music?
I think that's our responsibility and duty, to be blessed with the opportunity to have the platform, to have the power of a microphone, to not only tell our stories, but the stories of the people in our communities, to be a voice for the voiceless. That's part of the reason the culture was created.
Well, I think, we have to understand how our country works. And there's a reason that, our ancestors put their lives on the line for our ability to vote and have done all of these things, our long history of civil rights and all these things. Being able to vote was the number one thing that was fought for, because we know that that's how we can change the landscape of the country from a democracy standpoint. There's still a lot, obviously, that we have to do on top of that. But the very first thing, we know if you don't have a vote, you don't have a voice. You don't have a say in what happens to you. You don't have a say what happens on the community, your city, your state. And lives have been put on the line for that ability. And I think we all need to honor that and respect it and pay forward, not only for us, but also for the next generation.
It's important to our children. It's important to their future. So where it should rank is at the top, with everything else. I hope it continues to go until it gets there. You can still go to the club. You can still make the music you want, but also use that reward and that gift that you've been given to empower and make change in a positive way that's going to affect you as an artist. To my fellow artists, let's do this thing together, in your own way, but make it dope. Like, it matters.